All right, welcome back, everyone. So this is the final stretch. This is part 10 of Intimations of a New Worldview, and this is called Finding God. And this is going to be two videos. Both of them are going to be pretty long, so let's get into it. Before I get into the content of this video, I want to make it very clear about what my purpose with this particular video is. This video is largely personal. It is my attempt, which I am doing publicly, I guess. It is my attempt to come to terms with my culture. And Christianity is, to a large extent, at the core of Western culture, my culture. And there is no getting out from under that fact. Whatever the flaws with Christianity as it has been practiced for the last 2,000 years, right? Regardless of that, there's no getting out from under the fact that Western culture is inseparable from its Christian origins. I grew up going to a Southern Baptist church. I was saved as a kid, and I was very genuine in that. But I got bored with it in high school, and I stopped going. And I never really thought much of it after that. It wasn't something that seemed all that important to me. During my illness, and so I talked in part one about my 3 psychotic episodes in my early 20s. During the first bout of psychosis, I reached out to multiple pastors from my area, and I reached out to other Christians as well, and I received a response from none of them across the board. Every single person. I reached out to people who I knew were devout Christians because I was having essentially a religious crisis. I mean, that's really what it was, a kind of spiritual crisis, and none of them responded. And to a large extent, this kind of disillusioned me from Christianity. To some extent, that was part of it. To my mind, if a religion has nothing to offer somebody who is clearly going through a spiritual crisis, I can't really figure out what the use of it is. Besides being just a social club, which is what most churches are these days, as best I can tell. And I want to make clear that what I'm doing in this video is not trying to deconvert Christians. Like, if you're a Christian and you're watching this, my goal here is not, I'm not a new atheist, right? I'm not Richard Dawkins. I'm not here to tell you that your beliefs are stupid. My goal with this video is to find some version of Christianity that I could actually like, because what's on offer within mainstream Christianity right now has nothing to offer me as far as I'm concerned. The churches I've been to are social clubs more than anything else. The pastors, generally speaking, have nothing interesting to say, at least nothing that I find interesting. There's nothing about mainstream Christianity that I find to be inspiring, intellectually stimulating, or particularly useful at all. And this is not to say that there aren't individual Christians who I really like and who I do find inspiring and who I do think are really interesting. But they are outliers among Christianity as far as I'm concerned. Nietzsche subjected Christianity to a brutal critique in his book, The Antichrist, and elsewhere. The Antichrist was one of the last books Nietzsche wrote before he went insane. I think he was on the verge of insanity as he was writing it. Nietzsche made some mistakes in that book, but his main thesis was that Christianity had seriously deviated from the actual teachings of Christ. He was criticizing Christianity largely from within its own terms, on its own terms, right? Because as far as he was concerned, Christianity as it had manifested in the Western world had very little to do with Christ as he actually existed. He believed that modern Christianity had far more to do with the teachings of Paul than Christ. And I'm not going to talk too much about Paul here, so that's something that I'm going to write about. It's something that I've been doing quite a bit of reading about the influence of Paul on early Christianity. And that's something that I'm going to write about later on. But what I'm going to do in this video is make the case, at least in the first part of this video, I'm going to make the case that Nietzsche was largely right about this, that Christianity as we understand it now very likely has little to do with Christianity as it was originally understood, which of course, during the first 200 years, there was really no such thing as Christianity, right? It was a loose confederation of groups that saw Christ as a kind of divine figure. So here's the hypothesis that I'm going to be putting forward in this video. In the terms we have used in this series, Jesus was not a priest. Right? So I made this dichotomy in part. what was it, part 5 or part 6? Part 5. And part 5, I talked about this dichotomy between the priest and the shaman. And for pre-agricultural societies, the shaman was essentially the religious leader, and post-agricultural societies transitioned into a priesthood, into priestly forms of religion. My contention is that Jesus Christ, as even in the Gospels as we read them today, has far more in common with shamanic versions of religion than priestly versions of religion. Parables, for example, parables are extremely. They're not the kinds of things that you would normally find in a priestly religion, right? Because they're so mysterious, it's hard to tell what they mean. They're kind of poetic and vague. These are not the kinds of things that you would generally find in a systemized religion. My contention is that Christianity, which wasn't really Christianity at the beginning, but the original message had far more to do with imagistic or shamanic versions of religion than priestly or doctrinal. The problem with that is that shamanic or imagistic religions are not scalable. We talked about this in part 5, right? Because they rely on shared experiences, generally speaking, they are not scalable, right? It's hard to turn them into a kind of mass movement. And it is the case, if you look at the early history of Christianity, there were many versions of Christianity kind of battling it out within the first 200 years or so, especially, the first 100, 150 years. And the version that won out and became the Catholic Church, eventually became the Catholic Church, I would suggest was the most doctrinal version of the religion, right? So, we had all these different versions competing for dominance, let's say, of the Christian ethos. And the version that won out, which was, largely influenced by Paul, this was a priestly version of the religion, right? It was a doctrinal, it was taking a message that came from the mouth of somebody who was a shamanic type and converting it into a priestly or doctrinal religion. And so the version of Christianity that won out has far more to do with Paul than with Christ. Christianity as it is currently practiced, I would suggest, has very little to do with Christ. And I realize that saying that is going to offend some Christians, and this is not my concern. My concern is not to tell you things that are going to make you feel good. My concern is to say what I think is true about it. And given my readings about the origins of early Christianity, I think that what Christianity is today has essentially nothing to do with what it originally was. And I don't think that's a good thing. Abraham Maslow, I think understood this dynamic that happens with these kinds of things, with these kinds of movements. As he says, the original message of these kinds of movements is always corrupted by bureaucratic types, right? By these priestly types. He says about this, and I quote, that the characteristic prophet is a lonely man who has discovered his truth about the world, the cosmos, ethics, God, and his own identity from within, from his own personal experiences, from what he would consider to be a revelation. Usually, perhaps always, the prophets of the high religions have had these experiences when they were alone. Characteristically, the abstraction type of the legalist ecclesiastic, where he's talking about the priestly type, what I talked about in part 5 as the priestly type. This type of person is the conserving organization man, an officer and arm of the organization, who is loyal to the structure of the organization which has been built up on the basis of the prophet's original revelation in order to make the revelation available to the masses, in order to make it scalable, really. From everything we know about organizations, we may very well expect that people will become loyal to it, as well as to the original prophet and to his vision, or at least they will become loyal to the organization's version of the prophet's vision. I may go so far as to say that characteristically, and I mean not only the religious organizations, but also parallel organizations like the Communist Party or like revolutionary groups, these organizations can be seen as a kind of punch card or IBM version of an original revelation or mystical experience or peak experience to make it suitable for group use and administrative convenience. I think this is basically what happened with Christianity, that it was originally a much more imagistic or shamanic message, and it was converted to the version that we understand today because that's the version that was palatable to the masses, or at least that's the version that was scalable. Nietzsche, of course, in The Antichrist, criticized the dogmatism of Christian beliefs in the wake of the scientific revolution. He diagnosed Christianity's particular brand of willful blindness and corruption in the face of the scientific revolution. As he put it, and I quote, "A religion like Christianity, which does not have contact with reality at any point, which crumbles as soon as reality has conceded its rights at even a single point, must naturally be mortally hostile against the wisdom of this world, which means science. It will applaud all means with which the discipline of the spirit can be poisoned, slandered, brought into disrepute. Faith, as an imperative, is the veto against science. In practice, faith is the lie at any price." A little later he says, and I quote, "Because sickness is the essence of Christianity, the typical Christian state, faith must also be a form of sickness, and all straight, honest, scientific paths to knowledge must be rejected by the church as forbidden paths. Even doubt is a sin." End quote. As far as I'm concerned, the anti-scientific streak within Christianity has made itself all the more apparent since Nietzsche wrote this. We saw this, of course, in the 80s and 90s when fundamentalist Christianity had far more cultural power than it does now. We definitely don't ever want those kinds of people having any kind of power whatsoever, because we know exactly what they would do with it. Right? They would tell you that you're not allowed to teach evolution in schools, for example. Now, largely that culture war is over, and it was lost by those types of Christians, and thank God for that. But that streak has always been there, and it's a problem. At least from my own experience, modern, mainstream Christianity is almost always predicated on having the right beliefs about the divinity of Christ, about the resurrection, and so on. The basic message is that you have to believe certain things. You have to believe certain historical claims about the physical embodiment of God and a human being who came down, performed miracles, was killed, and then resurrected. Right? You have to believe those things, or else you're not saved. Often, and I've seen this personally multiple times. Depends on the denomination for how common this is, but often Christians are encouraged by their leaders to avoid contact with anything that might disrupt this so-called faith. Jehovah's Witnesses, for example. So I have some family members who are Jehovah's Witnesses. They're not allowed to watch TV. They're not allowed to read anything except for the Bible. They don't go to movies. Right? They are totally enmeshed within whatever, they are not allowed to subject themselves to any information that is not approved by their church. Okay, that's what they call faith. Sometimes on my way to school, just because I failed to change the channel, I listen to this Catholic talk radio. I'm not even really listening to it, but the talk radio host on there who works for the Catholic Church in town will often encourage people to avoid reading magazines, reading books that will disrupt their faith. Okay, that's not faith as far as I'm concerned. Like, that's how many Christians understand faith, but that's not faith. That's just called willful stupidity and blindness, right? And the fact that the Catholic Church and the Jehovah's Witnesses have both been involved in sexual scandals is not unrelated to the fact that they both have encouraged their adherents to avoid, to stick their head in the sand, right? Because if you're a sexual predator, what you really want is naive, blind individuals who you can take advantage of, right? And that's exactly what you get within the Jehovah's Witnesses and within large parts of the Catholic Church. The avoidance of information that might disrupt your faith, that whole mindset, as far as I'm concerned, makes it a lot easier for predators to take advantage of the ignorance of their constituents. That being said, right, so that is the dark side of Christianity as far as I'm concerned. I don't think that Christianity as a whole should be judged by its worst excesses. But we can't ignore those excesses either. There are many Christians who are obviously not like that, right? And it doesn't characterize all of Christianity, of course. But it's common enough that it should be something that we should question whether or not there's something really wrong with the fundamental Christian message that leads to that kind of attitude. On the right side of the screen here, I have a figure from Maps of Meaning, which is called the vicious circle of the adversary. And it describes this process by which people close themselves off from new information, and they become rigid and arrogant in that, in their ignorance. It involves the absolute identification with your current beliefs. Right? Well, this is a problem in Christianity as far as I'm concerned, because what they say apparently, is that you have to believe certain things if you want to be saved, right? Well, this is the beginning of the adversarial process, right? When you identify with your current beliefs so much that you think that you're going to burn in hell or whatever if you don't believe them, well, that means that you are now having to close yourself off against any information that might disrupt those beliefs. And that leads to the next step in the process, which is the rejection of creative exploration, right? So when the Jehovah's Witnesses tell their constituents that they're not allowed to read, they're not allowed to read books, they're not allowed to watch movies, they're not allowed to read. Okay, that's a rejection of the process of creative exploration. As far as I'm concerned, it's a rejection of God, but we'll get to that in the next video. The result of that will inevitably be a paralyzing fear of the unknown, right? Because if you never expose yourself to chaos, then you have no idea what to do in the face of chaos. And in that fear, it leads you to reject anything. It leads you to reject all chaos, right? All uncertainty. And that is the adversarial process. And the fact that Christianity can lead to that process is a problem, as far as I'm concerned. And the fact that it clearly has led to that process within the Catholic Church, within the Jehovah's Witnesses, and the fact that these places have given support to child molesters, right? Kind of unbelievable, right? That a religion like Christianity would put up with that, but maybe it's not that unbelievable. So all of that notwithstanding, right, I stand by my claim that the core of Christianity, properly understood, right, the core of Christianity as a mythos is this death and rebirth process that underlies creation itself, right? This process of complexification, which Christ was a presentation and manifestation of. Furthermore, as I said before, I think that Christianity is at the core of Western culture, and science, the greatest triumph of our culture, in my humble opinion, is a direct offspring of the 2,000-year training in truth under the auspices of the church. This was Nietzsche's claim as well. I mean, Nietzsche claimed that Christianity undermined itself because it put such an emphasis on truth, and then that emphasis on truth came back to bite itself in the back, because many of the propositions that Christians adhered to were clearly false, right? Like the idea that the Earth was 10,000 years old, or that the Genesis creation myth was literally true, or whatever. It's certainly not clear to me that there's ever going to be any getting out from under the very large shadow of Christianity in Western culture, even if we wanted to. And I don't want to. I mean, I'm not complaining about it. I'm complaining about how Christianity is understood today, but not necessarily about Christianity as a whole. And so a question here, is whether or not Christianity could incorporate the Nietzschean critique. My answer to that question is going to be yes and no. Clearly not Christianity as it is currently understood, right? Like, that's not going to happen. But I think there is an understanding of Christianity that is perfectly compatible with Nietzschean insights. Jordan Peterson in Maps of Meaning said this about Nietzsche's criticism of Christianity. He said, and I quote, that Nietzsche has been casually regarded as a great enemy of Christianity. I believe, however, that he was consciously salutary in that role. When the structure of an institution has become corrupt, particularly according to its own principles, it is the act of a friend to criticize it. And I agree. And that's what I'm going to try to do in this video as well. Nietzsche believed that Christianity had corrupted the true Christian message, the actual message of Christ. In the Antichrist, Nietzsche said about this, and I quote, that it is not a faith that distinguishes the true Christian. The Christian acts. He is distinguished by acting differently. The life of the Redeemer was nothing other than this practice, nor was his death anything else. He no longer required any formulas, any rites for his intercourse with God, not even prayer. He broke with the whole Jewish doctrine of repentance and reconciliation. He knows that it is only in the practice of life that one feels divine, blessed, evangelical, at all times a child of God. Repentance and prayers for forgiveness are not the ways to God. Only the evangelical practice leads to God. Indeed, this practice is God. Jesus disposed of the concepts of sin, forgiveness of sin, faith, redemption through faith. The whole Jewish ecclesiastical doctrine was negated in the glad tidings. The deep instinct for how one must live in order to feel oneself in heaven, to feel eternal, while in all other behavior one decidedly does not feel oneself in heaven. This alone is the psychological reality of redemption, a new way of life, not a new faith. Of course, this is radically different from how Christianity currently understands the Christian message. But more recent authors, some of whom are far more sympathetic to Christianity than Nietzsche was, have made very similar claims to Nietzsche about the original Christian message and how it has been corrupted. In particular, Mark Vernon. Mark Vernon wrote a very nice book called A Secret History of Christianity. I don't like that title of the book. The title sounds clickbaity, but it's not a clickbaity book at all. It's a really good work of scholarship. And Mark Vernon in this book said something very similar to Nietzsche about the deviation of Christianity from its origins. According to Vernon, Christianity was not always so predicated on belief. In its current state represents a corruption of what was originally meant to be a more participatory form of religion. He said about this, and I quote, "The root issue, I believe, lies in how Christianity has come to be presented, or, to be more precise, how religious Christians have come to misunderstand the message. What was once experienced as a pathway to more life has today morphed into a way of life that to outsiders seems self-evidently diluted, defensive, or distorted." And of course, that is the way that much of Christianity appears to me. He says a little later, and I quote, "It's not about how Jesus saves, to cite the trite formulation of our times that I believe puts so many people off, but rather is about how Jesus initiates a way that can become our own. It's about how Jesus invited his followers to take up their cross and work out their own salvation so that they too might know the mystery of life in all of its fullness." And I agree. And of course, that's very similar to how Nietzsche described it. Vernon is in agreement with Owen Barfield that early Christianity represented a state of original participation in which the adherence to abstract doctrines did not play a primary role, right? It was an embodied movement. Right? It's not about believing things, right? It's about a way of life. Too much of Christianity today reflects, as Ian McGilchrist put it, a text-based, black and white, intolerant fundamentalism at odds with any richer understanding of myth and metaphor. And I agree. Nietzsche also said in The Antichrist, and I quote, that the kingdom of heaven is a state of the heart. It is not something that is to come above the earth or after death. The kingdom of God is nothing that one expects. It has no yesterday, and it has no day after tomorrow. It will not come in 1,000 years. It is an experience of the heart. It is everywhere, and it is nowhere. End quote. Interestingly, these are things that Nietzsche wrote in the late 19th century, but they were supported by something that came along quite a bit later. In 1945, the Gospel of Thomas, along with some other ancient Christian texts, was discovered in a cave in Egypt. Many Christians will claim that the so-called Gnostic Gospels are heretical or whatever. They're not canon. They're not. We shouldn't pay any attention to them. Hopefully, you're well aware that I could care less what they think about it, right? So, I would much rather listen to the historians of early Christianity. And as far as I can tell, based on my reading, the Gospel of Thomas has as much claim to being authentic, to be an authentic document of the early Christians as the canonical Gospels. And the fact that it wasn't included in the canon has more to do with historical happenstance than any kind of deep actual reason. So, unlike the canonical Gospels, the Gospel of Thomas is a collection of sayings. These are utterances that Jesus was purported to have said during his life. The age and the origins of the sayings in the Gospel of Thomas are disputed somewhat. There's basically a consensus that they were probably created somewhere between 65 and 250 AD, which is roughly the same time period that the canonical Gospels were created. There is not, to my knowledge, any real consensus among the scholars as to how we should consider them in relation to the canon. And I'm not here to solve that issue, right? That's not what I'm doing. What I want to point out here is just that Nietzsche's claims about the origins of Christianity are extremely concordant with many of the sayings in the Gospel of Thomas. It's also, I could point out here that Jordan Peterson in Maps of Meaning quoted the Gospel of Thomas often. He ended the book with a long quote from the Gospel of Thomas. So Jordan also believes that the Gospel of Thomas and its sayings are concordant with everything that he argued in Maps of Meaning, and I agree. I'm not claiming here that Nietzsche was some kind of crypto-Christian. What I want to demonstrate here is that it is very plausible that Nietzsche's claims about the original Christian message are correct, that the original Christian message was corrupted by what Maslow called the legalist abstraction types, the early Christians, especially Paul. Since the Gospel of Thomas was discovered in 1945, of course, Nietzsche could not have had any knowledge of it. So the overlaps between them must be real convergences. Nietzsche said, as we just talked about, that the kingdom of heaven is not something that you expect. Rather, it is within you. He went on to say that the kingdom of heaven is everywhere and it is nowhere. Right? It's something like that. Jesus said something that was extremely similar to that in the Gospel of Thomas. He said, and I quote, that if those who lead to you say to you, see, the kingdom is in the sky, then the birds of the sky will precede you. If they say to you, it is in the sea, then the fish will precede you. Rather, the kingdom is inside of you, and it is outside of you. His disciples asked Jesus, when will the kingdom come? He said, it will not come by waiting for it. It will not be a matter of saying, here it is or there it is. Rather, the kingdom of the Father is spread out on the earth, and men do not see it. End quote. Of course, this is very different from how mainstream Christianity conceives of the kingdom of God, which, generally speaking, most Christians see as an afterlife, so some kind of heaven or afterlife, or as something that will occur after an apocalypse. Nietzsche claimed that the Christian is distinguished not by their beliefs or by their traditions, but by a distinguishing mode of being, right? A way of being in the world, a new way of life, and not a faith. In the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus said essentially the same thing. His disciples questioned him and said to him, do you want us to fast? How shall we pray? Shall we give alms? What diet shall we observe? Jesus said, do not tell lies, and do not do what you hate, for all things are plain in the sight of heaven. And so this is not an admonishment to believe anything or to perform rituals. Rather, it is an encouragement to live your life in a particular way, and in particular, to live your life with integrity. That the mode of being represented by Jesus was a life lived with integrity. And I think that's correct. So I also want to compare some of the sayings in the Gospel of Thomas to other aspects of Nietzsche's philosophy. Nietzsche said that suffering is not to be looked down on because suffering is an integral part of life, and Nietzsche was grateful for his suffering. And in the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus said almost the same thing. He said, blessed is the man who has suffered and found life. Suffering is a requirement for finding life, as far as I'm concerned. Nietzsche believed that it was the solitary, those who were willing and capable of separating themselves from the herd, who would be most likely to set forth on the path towards real freedom. Jesus said in the Gospel of Thomas, blessed are the solitary and the elect, for you will find the kingdom, for you are from it, and to it you will return. Jesus said a little later, many are standing at the door, but it is the solitary who will enter the bridal chamber. Again, I think this is very different from how Christianity currently understands salvation, which is more of a group activity for them. Nietzsche believed that conflict, strife, competition, war, and so on were necessary on the path towards more power and therefore more life, complexity, consciousness, right? Everything we've talked about here. Jesus said in the Gospel of Thomas that men think, perhaps, that it is peace which I have come to cast upon the world. They do not know that it is dissension which I have come to cast upon the earth, fire, sword, and war. For there will be 5 in a house, 3 will be against 2, and 2 against 3, the father against the son, and the son against the father, and they will stand solitary. Again, the overlaps that I'm pointing out here are not meant to indicate that Nietzsche was a kind of crypto-Christian. What I'm trying to do here is demonstrate that there is a plausible understanding of Christianity that is compatible with Nietzsche's insights, which is very strange, right? It's clearly not Christianity as it's currently understood. Currently, Nietzsche and Christianity are seen as opposites, right? Are seen as eternal adversaries. But there is a version of Christianity that is perfectly compatible with the historical texts of Christianity that is also compatible with Nietzsche. Again, this will have very little to do with Christianity as it's currently practiced. So what would it mean, right, in theory, right, if we wanted to reconcile these warring opposites? Right, what would it mean to incorporate the Nietzschean critique into Christianity? At the very least, I would suggest that it would mean no self-righteous moralism, as is so common among the people who call themselves Christians. No supernaturalism, You don't get a get out of jail free card, right? That's what supernatural explanations. That's what they are, right? They're non-explanations, right? Richard Dawkins is correct when he calls the Christian God the God of the gaps, right? Well, when you can't explain something, you don't just get to invoke a supernatural explanation and call it a day. And I see Christian thought leaders do this quite a bit. Not the sophisticated ones, right? So there are real sophisticated Christian thinkers who don't do this sort of thing, but you know what I mean. It's not mainstream Christianity. It would also mean a very different understanding of faith than is typical among Christians, since having faith in dubious historical propositions is only willful stupidity. Right? What Christians call faith, what many Christians call faith, is what I call willful blindness and stupidity. So it's not that. And the fourth would be that Christianity would represent a mode of being in the world, right? A way of life, and not a particular set of propositional beliefs. Given that Christianity, as it is generally understood, is a highly moralistic belief system based on supernatural claims about God and an afterlife, incorporating the Nietzschean critique is not realistic within mainstream Christianity, clearly. And that's not really my target audience here. Of course, I don't expect to convert mainstream Christians from their faith. I'm not trying to do that, and that's not my goal here. I expect that they'll continue to do what they're doing, regardless of what I have to say about it or anybody else. Rather, what I'm trying to do is understand if there's a way for me personally to understand Christ and Christianity that isn't moralistic and life-negating. I have an allergy, in some sense, to moralism and to self-righteousness. I don't like it, usually. There's exceptions, of course. Sometimes it's appropriate to be self-righteous, right? But not the kind of self-righteousness that I see from mainstream Christianity. And of course, I also have an allergy to supernaturalism. Can those allergies, let's say, be reconciled with my recognition that the Christian mythos is at the core of this culture that I am so grateful for? And I am extremely grateful for Western culture and the Western tradition. And I know that the Western tradition wouldn't be what it is if it wasn't for Christianity. And so that's a tension that exists within me. And so in order to see if that's possible, and in order to explore whether that's a possibility, a real possibility, we're now going to look at Nietzsche's views in comparison with those of Fyodor Dostoevsky, the Russian novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky. So Dostoevsky was a Russian novelist, and he wrote most of his books slightly before Nietzsche's intellectual career got off the ground. So Dostoevsky was active between 1845 and 1884. And Nietzsche discovered Dostoevsky's work in 1887, which was about 2 years before Nietzsche ended up going insane. Nietzsche claimed that this discovery was among the most joyous events of his life. And also, he said that Dostoevsky was the only psychologist who he ever had anything to learn from. And this is kind of strange, right? It's really strange, in fact, because at least on the surface, Nietzsche and Dostoevsky seem to be diametrically opposed to each other. Because, of course, Nietzsche was anti-Christian and Dostoevsky was a devout Christian. Nietzsche's highest value was basically truth, and Dostoevsky was clear that his highest value was love. And Nietzsche clearly preferred, to some degree, and I think Nietzsche was being a little bit ironic sometimes about these things, but he clearly preferred master morality to some degree over slave morality, and Dostoevsky clearly preferred slave morality over master morality. So on the surface, it seems like Dostoevsky ought to be somebody who Nietzsche is highly critical of. And Nietzsche was well aware of this fact, right? He was well aware that at least on the surface, himself and Dostoevsky seemed to be diametrically opposed. And despite this, Nietzsche had the utmost respect for Dostoevsky as a psychologist. And so why? Why did Nietzsche have so much respect for this person who clearly had beliefs that were antithetical to what Nietzsche believed, right? It's an interesting question. Evlampiev, in this 2002 paper, said that in the wake of the death of God, and in the wake of this tendency towards scientific rationalism and nihilism that was occurring in the 19th century, he said, and I quote, that only a few, especially insightful and sensitive thinkers, understood that it was necessary to go forward, not backward, not simply to deny the new tendencies, but to overcome them by including them in a broader context, by developing a more complex and profound worldview in which these new tendencies too would find a worthy place. The significance of Dostoevsky and Nietzsche consists in the fact that they laid the foundations of this worldview. I think that's right. If Olympiev goes on to say that despite their surface differences, the views of Nietzsche and Dostoevsky are more similar than they seem at first glance. They're more similar than they are different. He says about this, and I quote, that both of them were moving, albeit from different directions and on the basis of different initial principles, towards one and the same worldview, which gave, compared with the traditional conception of man, a completely new idea of his place in the world and role in history and the destiny of the universe. End quote. And I think this is an extremely interesting claim, given that Dostoevsky and Nietzsche were diametrically opposed in their attitudes towards Christianity. Right? The claim that they were both laying the foundations for a new worldview, which was the same worldview, right? Despite the fact that one came from an anti-Christian stance and one came from a Christian stance, right? Like, that's a really interesting claim. And it implies that there is some synthesis of Nietzsche and Dostoevsky that could be done, and a synthesis, therefore, potentially of Nietzsche's insights with Christianity, although not Christianity as it's currently understood, obviously. So both of these figures recognized the death of God. They recognized the importance, the monumental historical importance of the death of God. And they recognized the newfound lack of any stable source of meaning that this death of God represented. And yet, at least on the surface, they have very different reactions to this fact. Dostoevsky seemed to favor the religious form of revolution, while Nietzsche advocated the existentialist one. And as we'll see, despite these surface level differences, their reaction shares something very important in common. Before exploring that, we need to understand what it means to say that Nietzsche was an existentialist. Right? So if Dostoevsky was religious and Nietzsche was existentialist, what does it mean to say that somebody is an existentialist? So the Oxford Dictionary defines existentialism as a philosophical theory emphasizing the existence of the individual as a free and responsible agent determining his own development. And then we could ask, given that Nietzsche is often called an existentialist, how this could apply to Nietzsche, given that he is very famously opposed to the idea of free will. Nietzsche can be considered an existentialist because he aspired to make human beings more free and more responsible in the wake of the death of God. And so then we can ask, well, if he wasn't after traditional free will in the way that is normally conceptualized, like libertarian free will, which I talked about this in part 4 as something that I have no interest in. I have no interest in the debate over libertarian free will. The reason I have no interest in it is because the outcome of that debate is totally inconsequential to me. It wouldn't matter one bit to me. And so we can ask, well, if it's not that, like what kind of freedom is Nietzsche after here? Nietzsche sought to naturalize the concept of freedom. So libertarian free will, as it normally is understood, is not really a naturalistic concept. It's not explicitly supernatural, but it does have that kind of flavor to it. Nietzsche sought to naturalize the concept of freedom, and he conceptualized freedom as an ability rather than something that you're just given freely, which of course is the same way that I conceptualized it in part 4 of this series. According to John Richardson, in his very great book, in my opinion, Nietzsche's Values, from 2020, according to Richardson, Nietzsche identifies and rejects 2 alternative conceptions of freedom. In the first place, there is an animal freedom, in which a perfect synthesis of the drives eliminates internal conflict so that one can act instinctually with an internal feeling of control or self-mastery. So this is what happens when you are properly integrated. For Nietzsche, this is an important aspect of freedom, but it's incomplete. It's not complete freedom. And then there's human freedom as agency, in which we conceive ourselves to be free if our conscious reason is in control rather than our lower animal selves, right? Our instincts and all that. Well, that's what freedom looks like according to the ascetic ideal. And Nietzsche, the ascetic ideal, which we talked about in part 5. And Nietzsche rejects that conception of freedom, as do I. That's almost the opposite of freedom. Nietzsche attacks this second conception of freedom in multiple ways. In the first place, the idea that agency can be detached from your underlying drives or instincts is an illusion. Right? Sometimes people think that their reason is in control, but it's not. What we call that conscious reasoning in our heads is the expression of a uniquely human drive, but it's not in charge, even though it sometimes thinks it is. Again, we talked about a lot of this in part 5. In the second place, our reasoning ability is not an uncaused cause, right? As so many people before him had conceptualized it, right? Like that's like libertarian free will, this sort of uncaused cause that that unmoors you from the normal laws of causality. Um, so this is just Nietzsche's rejection of libertarian free will, as I reject it as well. The third reason is more interesting, so we're going to examine that in some detail. For Nietzsche, and for myself, the freedom that we think we have in our conscious reasoning is a kind of illusion. In reality, that capacity for reasoning serves merely to justify the moral precepts that we already hold, which we inherit from our culture. Richardson, in his book Nietzsche's Values, says about this, and I quote, "Agency chiefly expresses not my individual interests, but rather social and generic ones. So all its eyeing is a kind of sham, implanted in the interests of taming and hurting me. In this respect, my drives are really more me than my conscious thinking and choosing. Agency has been designed as an enemy of these drives, so the idea of agency's freedom conceals its own main function, to conform the individual to social rules and values. The agent prides itself on its autonomy, but is all the while choosing according to the social script." End quote. This is something that I'm probably going to write about at some point, because there's a really interesting idea here, which is that our development of individual responsibility, of this idea of individuals having free will, was actually just the internalization of the ascetic ideal. It was the internalization of group ideals. While we have the illusion from that view that we are acting according to our free will, right? In reality, what we're doing is choosing according to the social script that has been handed to us by our culture, and it's a very effective, it's a very effective method of social control. I would argue that this idea is well supported by modern psychology. As Jonathan Haidt has famously argued, our moral judgments are largely intuitive and unconscious, and our conscious reasoning mostly serves to justify the moral judgments that we already hold. Conscious reasoning is not, although it may seem this way to us, it is not how we come to decide our values or pass judgment on them. Not really, anyways. That process is mainly an intuitive process, and it largely reflects our biology and upbringing. For Nietzsche, this means that conscious reasoning mainly gives us an illusion of freedom, but it doesn't really give us the real thing. Richardson says, and I quote, that Nietzsche's heroes from the past are those who managed to forge a synthesis of the two kinds of freedom, freedom in the drives and freedom in agency. The freest act is that in which our own strongest, most finely practiced nature springs forth, and in such a way that at the same time our intellect shows its directing hand. Okay, this is the synthesis of instinct and reason. Right? It's you are free when you are able to overcome the internal conflict between your instincts and reason. Right, that's what freedom is for Nietzsche. Freedom is when what you consciously know that you need to do is the same as what your unconscious intuitions and drives propel you to do, so that you can act naturally and instinctually in the world, and that will be effective, rather than having to force yourself to do all sorts of things, right, and to overcome your instincts, right? Your instincts become your ally rather than your enemy, and that's what freedom is. In the first place, Nietzsche believes that modern people have the opportunity for an even higher form of freedom than his heroes from the past. So we may ask, why is that the case? And Nietzsche believes that it's because we now have the tools to consciously and explicitly understand where our values came from. That is, we have scientific understandings of history and psychology. These things were just getting off the ground during Nietzsche's day, but he was picking up on the underlying patterns very well, as far as I'm concerned. Nevertheless, the ability to scientifically understand one's own morality and values in order to overcome them and gain our freedom will be difficult, Nietzsche believes. So we can ask the question, what is it that would facilitate the enactment of this process by which we gain our freedom? In Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche said this about it, and I quote, "Confronted with a world of modern ideas which would banish everybody into a corner and a specialty, a philosopher, if there could be any philosophers today, would be forced to define the greatness of man, the concept of greatness, in terms precisely of man's comprehensiveness in multiplicity, his wholeness in manifoldness. He would even determine worth and rank according to how much and how many things a person could bear and take upon himself, how far a person could extend his responsibility." End quote. And so The revaluation of values, which is a requirement for true freedom, would require a person who could endure that great weight of responsibility. Under the task of revaluing values, Nietzsche says that a conscience would need to be steeled, a heart turned to bronze, in order to endure the weight of such responsibility. This is what Nietzsche is attempting to inculcate in us when he declares through the madman that God is dead and we killed him. We are all responsible for this catastrophe. A person's greatness, his comprehensiveness and multiplicity, that is, his complexity, right? In the terms we've used throughout the series, a person's complexity is determined according to how far that person can extend their responsibility. In other words, maximal responsibility is the mark of greatness and freedom. Freedom for Nietzsche is to be found in the adoption of maximal responsibility. And therefore, responsibility and freedom, which are often seen as opposites, are rather for Nietzsche two sides of the same coin. So we now come back to Dostoevsky, because this is where we see the real overlap between Nietzsche and Dostoevsky, because for Dostoevsky as well, responsibility was the path to salvation. Alyosha, who was the protagonist of Dostoevsky's final novel, The Brothers Karamazov, said this about that, and I quote, "There is only one way to salvation, and that is to make yourself responsible for all men's sins. As soon as you make yourself responsible in all sincerity for everything and for everyone, you will see at once that this is really so, and that you are in fact to blame for everyone and for all things. For I want you to know, my beloved ones, that every one of us is responsible for all men and for everything on earth. Not only responsible through the universal responsibility of mankind, but responsible personally, every man for all people, and for each individual man who lives on earth." And this is maximal responsibility. So Nietzsche's core message is, in this view, radical responsibility. In The Will to Power, in an unpublished note, Nietzsche asks, "What is noble? What is noble is that one instinctively seeks heavy responsibilities." And this is also Dostoevsky's core message. It is also, as far as I'm concerned, the core message of Christianity, if we remove the moralistic and supernatural fluff. By taking on responsibility, we rid ourselves of all ressentiment. Right? It's the cure for ressentiment, for what Nietzsche called ressentiment, that curdling resentment. Nietzsche said in The Antichrist, and I quote, "Evidently, the small community did not understand the main point, the exemplary character of Jesus' kind of death, the freedom, the superiority over any feeling of ressentiment, a token of how little they understood him altogether. Once more, the popular expectation of a Messiah came to the foreground. A historic moment was envisaged. The kingdom of God comes as a judgment over his enemies. But in this way, everything is misunderstood. After all, Jesus had been precisely the presence, the fulfillment, the reality of this kingdom. Just such a death was this very kingdom of God." And so to take on maximal responsibility is to live and to die without any hint of ressentiment. Right? That is the task that Jesus Christ exemplified with his life, according to Nietzsche. And I think Nietzsche's right about that. And of course, it's also, although Dostoevsky uses different terms, he sees Christ in the same way. And I think Nietzsche understood that very well. Now, talking about radical responsibility, this can be misunderstood. Obviously, it doesn't mean that you should take on every problem in the world all at once, right? You have to be realistic. But it is to say that growth and meaning are to be found in the adoption of responsibility, and that the more responsibility you take on, right, the heavier the load that you choose voluntarily to bear, the more you will grow and find meaning in life. And by taking on enough responsibility, life becomes meaningful enough to justify the suffering and the malevolence that's inherent to it without becoming bitter and resentful about it. Life can be terrible, right? And you need something to sustain you through that. And what sustains you through that is not freedom, at least as it's normally conceptualized. What sustains you through that is responsibility, is having something to do that you really value. In this way, as Nietzsche said of the Dionysian sacrifice, being is counted as holy enough to justify even a monstrous amount of suffering. And that's the attitude that you come to if you take on enough responsibility. That would be the suggestion of Nietzsche. So we want to come back to this idea of faith, right? Because I think there is an important understanding of faith. Like, I think there's a very real kind of faith that you can have, but it's not faith in terms of what I see from mainstream Christianity, which, as I've said before, is just willful stupidity. As Nietzsche recognized, and as is so painfully obvious in interacting with many contemporary Christians, faith is often construed as the belief in propositions for which there is insufficient evidence. That is what faith literally means among many Christians. There's a lot of Christians who would deny that, but it's like, I've interacted with enough Christians in my life to know that that's exactly what they mean by faith. And even sometimes believing something against which there is insurmountable evidence, that also taken to the extreme, that can be faith too. This is not faith. This is just willful stupidity misunderstood as a virtue, taking a vice and making it a virtue. Willful stupidity is obviously not a virtue. In the terms we've developed through this series, what is faith? Right? How can we understand faith that doesn't require us to think that it's equivalent to willful stupidity? And I think that a passage from Maps of Meaning can clarify this. Jordan says in Maps of Meaning, and I quote, "When faced with a paradox whose solution is impossible in terms of the historical canon, which is that established axiomatically predicated hierarchy of values and assumptions, the hero takes inspired action and transcends his culturally determined limitations. Instead of denying the existence of the problem, and therefore tormenting those who cannot help but posit it, the revolutionary hero accepts the apparently impossible task of solution and of reuniting the warring opposites. He admits the possibility of successful solution, not because the problem can be minimized, but because he believes that human nature can expand to meet it. Such belief, faith, provides the precondition for courage." Faith is to believe in this process of creative exploration, right? To believe in this mode of being, because you don't know what the future is going to be, right? And so you have to have a kind of faith that if you act properly, right? If you act out this process, let's say this mode of being, that it will produce the best possible world, right? At least, it's most likely to produce the best possible world, right? That's faith in some sense. Identification with the heroic process, in this view, is equivalent to identification with Christ. There's no need to believe anything, right? That identification is faith. Jordan Peterson, in Maps of Meaning, also stated that organized Christianity's presumptions were based on an error. He said about this, and I quote, that organized Christianity has sterilized itself, so to speak, by insisting on the worship of something external as the means to salvation. The alchemists rediscovered the error of this presumption and came to realize that identification with the Redeemer was in fact necessary, not his worship. They came to realize that myths of redemption had true power when they were incorporated and acted out rather than believed in some abstract sense. This meant to say that Christ was the greatest man in history, a combination of the divine and mortal, was not sufficient expression of faith. Sufficient expression meant, alternatively, the attempt to live out the myth of the hero within the confines of individual personality, to voluntarily shoulder the cross of existence, to unite the opposites within a single breast, and to serve as active conscious mediator between the external generative forces of known and unknown. Faith is a mode of being in the world. It's not a belief. Christ is a mode of being to be identified with, and not an abstract belief to be assented to. Faith entails the belief that the mode of being characterized by the mythological hero will, in the end, and despite much suffering along the way, produce the best possible world. To have faith is to risk the instability of chaos on the one hand and the wrath of the conformist social group on the other, in the name of truth. To have faith is to believe in the process, rather than some static set of propositions. The latter, when taken on as a virtue, is merely willful blindness and stupidity, which is what much of Christianity promotes and has promoted for a very long time. Jordan said in Maps of Meaning, and I quote, that what this means at the most fundamental level of analysis is that the pattern of action, imagination, and thought that Christ represents is necessarily there in any narrative or mythology sufficiently compelling to embed itself in memory. The reasons for this implicit existence are clear in a sense. Christ embodies the hero, grounded in tradition, who is narrative depiction of the basis for successful individual and social adaptation. As the Word made flesh, there in the beginning, he represents simultaneously the power that divides order from chaos and tradition rendered spiritual, abstract, declarative, semantic. His manner of being is that which moves morality itself from rule of law to rule of spirit, which means process. Spirit is process, simultaneously opposed to and responsible for generating static being. For Christ, God is not the God of the dead, but of the living. Christ pushes morality beyond strict reliance on codified tradition, the explicit law of Moses, not because such tradition was unnecessary, but because it was and is necessarily and eternally insufficient. End quote. So to believe in Christ is to believe in the process rather than a proposition about his historical, actions or whatever, which you can have no way of actually knowing anything about. I mean, barely anything about anyways. So Nietzsche and Dostoevsky were united in their belief that the proper response to the problem of our age lies in the adoption of responsibility. There are still differences, however. For Nietzsche, the will to truth is the primary path towards overcoming nihilism. For Dostoevsky, however, it is not truth but love, which is the proper path. Stalino quoted this, said, and I quote, that as Alyosha puts it, I think that everyone should love life before everything else in the world. Love it before logic, and only then will I also understand its meaning. And so then we can ask the question, which first, right? Is it truth or love? And I'm going to briefly attempt here to show that these are not necessarily in conflict, but rather constitute a synthesis. That properly understood, truth and love there need not be any conflict between these values that are inherent to the Christian worldview. So almost everything that I've said in this series up to this point centers the masculine. Right? It centers the logos, masculine consciousness, the spirit of positive masculinity, and it also centers the individual, right? The hero, and so on. And so the question, a couple questions come up here, which is that, in this worldview that I'm putting forward, right, in this series of videos, what role does the feminine play? What role does the community play? And John Vervaeke's discussion of agape in his YouTube series, Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, I think can help to answer these questions. For many Christians, God was logos, and God was also agape. And so we're now going to look at what agape is. The Greeks. So in our own language, we have one word for love. And this is very insufficient because, of course, the way that you love a friend is not the way that you love your child, right? And the way that you love your romantic partner is not the way that you love a friend or that you love a child, right? These are really different kinds of love. And the Greeks had different words for these. So eros, right? Eros is the root word of erotic. It's the love that seeks to be one with something, a kind of merging. Eros is a consuming love, and it's often used to describe romantic relationships. Philia is reciprocal love. Right? This is the kind of love that you have for people who you are in deep reciprocal relationships with. This is used to describe friendships mainly. Agape, on the other hand, is a forgiving love and a self-sacrificing love. This is the kind of love that a parent has for a child. And agape is what Jesus was referring to when he said that my command is this, to love each other as I have loved you. Agape is supposed to be the Christian kind of love. So most of what I have to say here about agape comes from the lectures of John Vervaeke in his Awakening from the Meaning Crisis series. John makes the claim that agape is the kind of love that creates persons. And it's a forgiving love, which means that you love before the person has earned it, right? You give before anybody has earned anything, right? Just as you would love your child, you would love an infant before they've earned anything, right? They didn't do anything to deserve that love, right? You just you love them because it's in your nature to love them, right? So it's a forgiving kind of love. And by loving a non-person in this way, you help them to become a person. John said about this, and I quote, that it's a powerful, creative, God-like ability that we have. By participating through love in another being, we can transform that being from a non-person into a person who can enter into a community of persons and find meaning and fellowship and belonging. End quote. And that's largely what early Christianity in the Roman Empire was offering people. They were offering the slaves and the low status people of the empire an opportunity to be real persons, right? Like in a community of other people who saw them as real persons rather than just slaves or women or whatever. And so agape brings people into the fold of personhood. In his great book, Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl said this about love. He said, and I quote, that love is the only way to grasp another human being in the innermost core of his personality. No one can become fully aware of the essence of another human being unless he loves him. By his love, he is able to see the essential traits and features in the beloved person. And even more, he sees that which is potential in him, that which is not yet actualized, but yet ought to be actualized. Furthermore, by his love, the loving person enables the beloved person to actualize these potentialities. By making him aware of what he can be and of what he should become, he makes these potentialities come true. Well, I think that's the best, one of the best descriptions of agape I've ever seen. Viktor Frankl doesn't use the word agape, but that is the agapic kind of love. It's the kind of love that looks at another person and says, you're not okay the way you are because you could be way more than what you are. And I see that potential in you and I want to bring it out, right? And that's essentially agape. Nietzsche is a well-known critic of pity. And this is often misunderstood, I think. So Richardson has argued in Nietzsche's values that Nietzsche wasn't trying to do away with pity completely, right? We naturally pitiable creatures. Rather, Nietzsche was trying to reorient how it is that we pity other people and the reasons for which we pity other people. And Nietzsche says, and I believe this is true, that we really shouldn't pity people for their hardship and suffering. Like, this is not the right thing to pity people for. I mean, there's a limit to that, of course, because some people really suffer. But for the most part, right, especially adult men, we should not pity them for their hardship. Right? Hardship and suffering are unavoidable and often necessary on the path to greater power and complexity. What would we do without our problems? Right? What would I do without my? I mean, I mean this, and this sounds a little arrogant, but like I'm relatively proud of the person that I've become over the last 7 years, and I know that none of that would have happened if it wasn't for the terribleness of what happened in my early 20s, and I don't want anybody's pity for that, right? Fuck that. I'm glad that it happened. I'm glad that I became the person that I became through my suffering, and so that kind of pity, right? Pity for hardships like that, it's life negating. Besides that, to pity someone because of their low station in life, right? So often people, they pity other people because they're low status or whatever. All too often, Nietzsche notices, and I notice too, that this is a way for people with a higher station in life to display and reinforce their own superior status by humble bragging or virtue signaling. It's no secret that wokeness, what you might call wokeness, like that attitude, is way more common among the upper middle class and the working class. And it's because the working class doesn't pity people for their, for being working class, right? That's the virtue signaling of the upper middle class, white people mostly. Nietzsche said that if we must pity, we should do it in secret rather than wearing it on our sleeves. And I totally agree with this. I mean, when people express their pity in public, what I see is somebody who is ashamed of the fact that they are not particularly compassionate, right? If you're a really compassionate person, you have no need to wear it on your sleeve. And in fact, you would probably be Nietzsche said, as Nietzsche put it, they are ashamed of their ebb and you are ashamed of your flood, right? And that's the difference between somebody who wears their pity on their sleeve and the person who would never show their pity publicly because they would be too ashamed of it, and rightfully so. Furthermore, we should not pity people for their hardship and suffering, but rather for their stagnation. This is what I pity people for. It's for their stagnation, right? When I look at these men who spend like 10 hours a day playing video games and jerking their little ding-dongs, I don't pity them because they're suffering. I pity them because they're clearly not becoming who they could be. And that's a tragedy, right? That's where my pity comes from. And it's not a pity that says, oh, you need... It's not a pity that says, "Oh, we need to, give you, I don't know, welfare or something." It's a pity that says, "How about you get your shit together?" We should pity people for their stagnation, right? Their inability or unwillingness to participate in the process by which they grow into more complete persons. This is the agapic kind of pity, I would argue. The kind of pity that I see from the contemporary left, let's say. Which likes to wear its pity for the poor and for minorities and so on its sleeve. This is not the agapic kind of pity. It's the virtue signaling kind of pity, and I want nothing to do with it. John Vervaeke said that we are born out of an agapic love that precedes us. In our agapic love, we are participating in the process that made us. The agape that precedes me flows through me and transforms me. Right? The process that made us is love, right? Because we can't survive as human beings without the love of the people around us, especially when we're infants, right? The love of our mother, is the most obvious example. For the early Christians, God is agape. God is this process that we participate in. It made you. You didn't make it. It made you. It precedes you and flows through you, and you participate in it insofar as you help other people to come to personhood through you. It's a quote from John Vervaeke. So as John said, these ideas have become so ossified and sedimented in our culture that they're like the ground we walk on. And like the ground we walk on, we often have nothing but contempt for them without really realizing how much they hold everything up. It holds everything up because we all rely on this agapic love to become who we are. And, the word love, I don't like using the word love that much because it's become cheesy. It's become like a cliche. Within our culture, and what many people seem to mean by love is not what I mean by love. Like my agapic love is not nice necessarily, right? It doesn't involve being nice. It doesn't involve wearing your pity on your sleeve, right? This is a different kind of love. In his 2020 book, Transcend, Scott Barry Kaufman reviews Abraham Maslow's concept of being love, what Maslow called being love or be love, which I would argue is equivalent to agape. Scott Kaufman said about this in the book, and I quote, that Maslow explicitly distinguished needing love from unneeding love and referred to the former as de-love, or deficiency love, and the latter as be-love, or love for the being of another person. Whereas de-love can be gratified, the entire concept of gratification hardly applies to be-love. Instead of needing, be-love is admiring, and instead of striving for satiation, be-love usually grows rather than disappears. End quote. And that's agape. Interestingly, Maslow said something about this kind of love that is very similar to a Nietzschean idea. This is a quote from Scott Kaufman's book. He's quoting Maslow here. Maslow said, and I quote, that self-actualizers have no serious deficiencies to make up and must now be looked upon as freed for growth, maturation, development, in a word, for the fulfillment and actualization of their highest individual and species nature. What such people do emanates from growth and expresses it without striving. They love because they are loving persons, in the same way that they are kind, honest, natural. That is, because it is in their nature to be so spontaneously. As a rose emits perfume, as a cat is graceful, or as a child is childish. End quote. This is the transcendence of morality. Right? Like this is what it means to go beyond good and evil. The person who is healthy, let's say, and integrated, doesn't need morality to act like a human being or to act properly, let's say. It comes spontaneously. It's an expression of their health. For Nietzsche, as for Maslow, real love comes from a position of strength. And that doesn't necessarily mean physical strength, of course. It comes from somebody who is overflowing with life, rather than a place of weakness, where often what is called love is just disguised ressentiment. So agape can be thought of as the process by which you facilitate another person's enactment and embodiment of the logos, which is this heroic process, right? The logos is another way of talking about this process of complexification that's at the bottom of everything, right? And agape can be thought of as the process by which you facilitate somebody's enactment of that process of complexification. And so in that sense, agape and logos are mutually reinforcing. As William James said, the community stagnates without the impulse of the individual, but that impulse dies away without the sympathy of the community. And that's the mutually reinforcing nature of agape and logos. Agape is the kind of love that Geppetto had for Pinocchio in the movie Pinocchio, or in the story. Geppetto loves Pinocchio, even when he is a useless pile of wood. Right? And through his love, through that forgiving love, he loves before Pinocchio is useful. Through that love, he is able to. Pinocchio is able to become a real boy. Right? Well, this is that story, right? It's through that love we are able to become real persons. And what I would suggest is that agape is an infinitely scalable, non-zero-sum game. So, if you enact this process of complexification, what that means is that you're going to go out in the world and you're going to use the terms we've used in the series. You're going to go out in the world and you're going to discover and facilitate non-zero-sum games, which I will benefit from. Myself and my family will benefit from your heroic endeavors. And so agape is a real non-zero-sum game, right? If you fulfill your potential in the world and you self-actualize, let's say, you're going to go out and you're going to solve problems, right? And your solving of those problems will benefit me and everybody that I love as well. And so it's a kind of infinitely scalable non-zero-sum game as far as I'm concerned. As John Vervaeke has argued, agape is not in you. Rather, it is something that you dwell within. Right? You dwell within the community of agape that you were born into, hopefully. And this is related to the fact, to what John Vervaeke calls the agent-arena relationship. So John makes the case, this is from Zombies in the Western World, that a worldview is two things simultaneously. It turns the individual into an agent who acts, and it turns the world into an arena in which those actions make sense. And so this is the agent-arena relationship. And so what I would suggest is that the logos, or what has been called the logos, this process of complexification, is a process that you enact and embody as an agent. Agape, on the other hand, is a kind of communal process. It's what you dwell within. Right? Agape is not in you. Right? It's something that you dwell within. It's the arena. Logos and agape, therefore, constitute an agent-arena relationship that we can aspire to. It's not necessarily a description of the world as it is, rather than a description of the world as it ought to be. So what this is, what the logos and agape agent-arena relationship is, or what it can be thought of as, is internal complexification in the service of external complexification, right? So we've talked about this process of complexification, and it manifests internally as putting yourself together, as discovering non-zero-sum games amongst your own drives and instincts that can be put together into a way of life that will reduce that inner conflict and make you into an integrated and powerful agent in the world, right? So that's that process of complexification. Agape means that you are internally complexifying. You are complexifying yourself in the service of external complexification. That is, in the service of facilitating that process in others around you. And so we can aspire, in this view, to enact and embody the logos in the service of facilitating an agapic communal process, which is a non-zero-sum game. Vervaeke says that fit together, the agent and arena mutually make sense of one another, and they ratify each other's existence and intelligibility. I would suggest that logos and agape fit this description, that dwelling within agape facilitates the embodiment of the logos, and at the same time one must embody the logos in order to cultivate an agapic arena. And my suggestion would be that Christ, properly understood, was a narrative presentation of this mode of being. He embodied the logos in the service of agape. So, unlike traditional moralities, the worldview that I'm putting forward here does not denigrate or despise or deny the existence of selfish or individualistic motivations within us. We strive for status. We are competitive. We want to be stronger and better and more powerful than others. And that's a part of our human nature, and there's nothing wrong with it. The attempt to deny or suppress these impulses by morality is a primary source, I would argue, of our modern sickness, helped along by much of Christianity. Of course, we also know what happens, right, when the selfish or individualistic motivations come to dominate the psyche, right? This is psychopathy or narcissism or whatever, right? And we don't want that either. And so the proper mode of being synthesizes the selfish instincts with the selfless ones, right? We talked about this in part 5. And so here it is recognized that the most characteristically human expression of these values is in the discovery and facilitation of non-zero-sum games. That's the most characteristically human expression of the selfish and individualistic desires for power, essentially. Our most characteristic way of gaining power within our group, let's say, is to discover and facilitate non-zero-sum games. And that's logos in the service of agape. And thus, there is a synthesis of individualistic striving and more communal motivations without there being a denial or a suppression of either. Right? We want a synthesis of those. So I want to compare this idea to what Maslow said about synergy and self-actualization. This is also from Scott Barry Kaufman's book, Transcend. He says, and I quote, that self-actualizing work is simultaneously a seeking and fulfilling of the self and also an achieving of the selflessness, which is the ultimate expression of real self. In this way, according to Maslow, the ordinary dichotomy between selfish and unselfish is resolved because people who pursue their selfish gratifications are automatically helping others. Vice versa, when they are being altruistic, they are automatically rewarded and gratified because what pleases them the most is using their wealth and competence to benefit all the other members of the culture. In such cultures, Maslow pointed out, virtue pays. And this is really important, right? Because what you want in a culture is for the incentives to be aligned with what you actually want to occur. And in a culture that is predicated upon agape or the synthesis of logos and agape, the incentives, you would be incentivized to cultivate that process in other people. Now, what that would look like in detail is hard to tell. And, this is kind of an abstract notion, but at least in theory, that's the idea. And so in a culture predicated on agape, right, striving forward in the world and helping others realize their potential are the same thing. Right? So trying to increase your own status, let's say, is the same thing as trying to help others achieve their potential. Right? Like that's what you're given status for in some important way. And so they're mutually reinforcing. And so one can enact and embody the logos in the service of agape. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit here. We're going to talk about this book by Arthur Koestler. It'll be very clear, I think, why this is relevant here in just a minute. But Arthur Koestler wrote this book in 1967 called The Ghost in the Machine, which is a great book. In my opinion, it's a really great book, underappreciated. Arthur Koestler used general systems theory to argue that all of reality has a hierarchical structure in which each new whole that emerges eventually becomes a part in the next level of the structure. And so this is pretty easy to understand. Atoms become molecules, molecules become cells, cells become organisms, organisms become groups of organisms, and so on. And so every unit in this hierarchy has a dual nature. And Koestler refers to these as holons, and he calls it a holarchy because he sees it as being different from the traditional understanding of hierarchy, which it is, but I'm not going to use the technical term here. I assume you know what I mean when I say hierarchy, and I'm not talking about like a dominance top-down hierarchy. The reason he calls it a holarchy is because the bottom of the hierarchy has just as much influence on the top as the top has on the bottom, which is kind of different from how hierarchy is normally construed. But I don't think that we're going to cause much confusion by just calling it a hierarchy. So the holon is a whole individual on the one hand, and it's part of a collective on the other, right? So it has this dual nature, right, which is its individualistic nature and then its collective nature. So Koestler says about this, and I quote, that every holon has the dual tendency to preserve and assert its individuality as a quasi-autonomous whole, and to function as an integrated part of an existing or evolving larger whole. This polarity between the self-assertive and integrative tendencies is inherent in the concept of hierarchic order, and it's a universal characteristic of life, end quote. So this book was written quite a while ago, but these ideas are not outdated by any means. They're still used, occasionally anyways. Kessler's ideas are still used in modern systems theory. I'll put an example in the description below. And so this, I would suggest, is the dual nature of reality, from the smallest and simplest levels of analysis to the largest and the most complex. At every level, right, the units that emerge have both this self-assertive tendency and the integrative tendency. From the perspective of a holon, a non-zero-sum game is one in which the holon is able to express its self-assertive tendency while simultaneously being integrated into a coherent whole. So we can think about human drives this way as well, or our instincts. According to Richardson, Nietzsche's values, each drive should, and I quote, have allegiance to the whole, but also to their distinguishing aims. They want to improve the whole by increasing their part in it. And so our own drives, right, our own instincts need to be involved in a non-zero-sum game internally. They need to be both self-assertive and integrative. And so my contention is that the synthesis of logos and agape, right, this synthesis of logos and agape in an agent-arena relationship is an expression of this idea. Logos is the self-assertive tendency and agape is the integrative tendency. Logos and agape represent the positive aspects of these tendencies. There are clearly negative aspects of these tendencies as well. Of course, taken to its extreme, the self-assertive tendency can be very destructive. Taken to its extreme, the collective tendency can be even more destructive, right? Because this is the underlying basis of ideologies like communism and fascism, right? These are collectivist ideologies. That's the collectivist. It's that collectivist. I don't want to call it an instinct because it's more fundamental than an instinct. It's the collectivist tendency as it expresses itself in political ideologies. So we're now going to see why these tendencies may be associated with the masculine and the feminine and with order and chaos. So to integrate this with everything else that we've talked about in this series of videos. So why is it that the self-assertive tendency would be associated with order, right? So the self-assertive tendency is associated with the masculine aspect of the world and with order. And Kessler explains this very nicely, right? Despite the fact that this was written a long time ago, he sees this connection as well, interestingly enough. He says, and I quote, that in adult behavior, the self-assertive tendency of functional holons is reflected in the stubbornness of instinct rituals or fixed action patterns, of acquired habits, handwriting, or spoken accents, and in the stereotyped routines of thoughts, end quote. And so habits, routines, rituals, etc. are themselves holons within us and express their self-assertive tendencies within us through being resistant to change. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? There needs to be a conservative tendency to the holon, or else it would just fall apart constantly. So we also, as holons, can express our self-assertive tendency in the context of our groups by being resistant to changes that would disrupt our own mode of being in the world, which again is not necessarily a bad thing. And so, in other words, Kessler makes the case. And I think there's room to flesh this idea out a lot more. I'm not saying that we should be fully convinced by this, but I think it's extremely interesting to me that he did make this case in 1967, long before these ideas had been developed by Jordan Peterson in Maps of Meaning, right? He makes the case that the self-assertive tendency is associated basically with inertia, which is order, right? Which is habit, right? So we talked in part 5, I quoted Terence McKenna. Terence McKenna conceptualizes the world as this dynamic between habit and novelty, which is, of course, order and chaos, right? Well, the self-assertive tendency manifests as habit, basically. So why would the integrative tendency be associated with chaos? And again, this is something that Kessler associated with. Kessler said, and I quote, that the integrative tendency is reflected in flexible adaptations, improvisations, and creative acts which initiate new forms of behavior. And all of these are associated with chaos psychologically. And so our capacity for insight is, as we've seen, it's intimately related to the discovery and facilitation of new kinds of non-zero-sum games, which is that integrative tendency. This can occur internally in the discovery of new relations between one's drives and habits. So we have insights that integrate us internally, and that reduces internal conflict. It can also occur externally in the discovery of new cooperative games that reduce conflict among groups of individuals. And so this capacity for insight, which is a capacity for behavioral flexibility, and those are the same thing, is therefore a reflection of an integrative tendency, because whether it's occurring internally or externally, the discovery of non-zero-sum games, which is a form of integration, requires insight. Major evolutionary transitions, which are also a form of integration, is like the transition from single-celled to multicellular life, and so on. These also very likely require a period of increased entropy or chaos. We talked about this a little bit in part 3. Relatedly, Davidson and Mykod, and I'll put the paper in the description, they associate phenotypic plasticity or flexibility with major evolutionary transitions. These transitions necessarily involve the discovery, not necessarily conscious or intentional discovery, of a new kind of non-zero-sum game that can lead to many organisms or holons coming together into a new single kind of holon, right? So that integrative tendency is associated with the capacity for insight and the capacity for discovering non-zero-sum games. So we have that the self-assertive tendency is associated with order according to Kessler, and the integrative tendency, is associated with chaos according to Kessler. So what about the masculine and the feminine? The agent-arena relationship has been mythologically represented in masculine and feminine terms. The mythological hero, which is inevitably masculine, the mythological hero is the individual, right? It's the expression of the logos, and the mythological hero is always masculine, generally speaking. The Great Mother, on the other hand, who is nature itself, who is the container of the world, is invariably feminine, right? And you see this represented mythologically, where the Great Mother is actually literally represented as a container of the world often. The word matter comes from the same root word as mother, and this is a vestige of the fact that the material world, which is, I think, not generally what a lot of people think it is. It's more like a chaotic underlying potential than inert matter, but that's a different subject. The material world has been represented as feminine mythologically. So if Hagen and Garfield, in their 2019 paper that I talked about quite a bit in part 3, are correct about their contention that the evolution of the human brain was driven by social and sexual selection for the propensity to discover and facilitate non-zero-sum games, right? If they're correct about that, then human encephalization has occurred at least in part because men have been selected for their capacity to enact and embody the logos, as was described by Jordan Peterson earlier. And this is the spirit of leadership, essentially. It's the spirit that discovers and facilitates non-zero-sum games, and it shares an identity with the spirit that is involved in the bringing to being of everything. Now, look, I'm not going to go through these arguments in detail at this point in the series, right? If these arguments are things that I've already talked about in parts 2, 3, and 4 mainly. I'm assuming that you already know all of that stuff, and I'm not going to go into the evidence in detail. So, don't tell me that I need to bring to bear more evidence on this. I've already done it, part 3 and 4, 2, 3, and 4. So, encephalization in women, on the other hand, was thought to be primarily driven by selection for the propensity to be a skilled mother. And that requires many of the same attributes as being a skilled cultural leader. It involves the ability to discover and facilitate non-zero-sum games among her family. Encephalization in women, then, was primarily selected because it promotes skill in the creative process of making persons out of non-persons, and we've called that agape. The mother with child on the right is an important representation of agape. We find this symbol in essentially every culture that has ever existed, right? All cultures, all major civilizations have elevated this image of the mother with the child in some way or another. And it's an important representation of agape, I would suggest. It's a worship of that agapic process in some sense. And so from an evolutionary perspective, logos and agape recapitulate this masculine-feminine agent-arena relationship. It really is the case, properly understood, given the understanding of logos that we've developed in this series. Logos really is associated with the masculine and with masculinity, and agape is associated with the feminine and femininity. Logos is the masculine individuating force, and agape is the feminine integrating force, right? That's one way of thinking about it. Scott Kaufman, again, reviews research on what would have been called agentic and communal motivations, and how their integration is necessary for optimal functioning. So this is from a paper by Wiggins from 1991. They say that agency refers to the condition of being a differentiated individual, and it is manifest in strivings for mastery and power which enhance and protect that differentiation. Communion refers to the condition of being part of a larger social or spiritual entity, and it is manifested in strivings for intimacy, union, and solidarity with that larger entity. And I would suggest that description of agency and communion, which comes from like social psychology, pretty much precisely mirrors Kessler's description of the dual nature of holons, right? That's the self-assertive tendency, which is agency. It's the integrative tendency, which is communion. And the reason I bring this up is because these were originally associated with masculinity and femininity. In fact, when these constructs were originally put forward, they were identified. They were identical to masculinity and femininity. That's changed since then, but not for any good scientific reason, largely because it was not politically correct to say that agency is masculine for these idiotic scientists who need to be in conformity with their peers about their moral stupidities. So, whatever. The fact is that agency is definitely associated with perceptions of masculinity, and communion is definitely associated with perceptions of femininity. Agency and community were originally conceptualized as being identical to those constructs. So, Scott Kaufman in Transcend says that be-loving people, right, and be-loving is the agapic kind of love, right? People who display this agapic kind of love show that agency and communion need not be at odds with each other. Those with higher agency in life show greater independence, assertiveness, and constructive use of anger, display less emotional distress and anxious attachment, and are embedded in more supportive social networks. Complementarily, those with higher communion are more comfortable with social relationships, are unlikely to experience problems when in relationships, and are more likely to have support available when in distress. It's clear that both of these dimensions of human existence can be in great harmony with each other, leading to greater growth and wholeness. End quote. He goes on to say a little later that it's important to cultivate a healthy integration of agency and communion, and recognize that both unmitigated agency, which would be over-dominance and control of others, and unmitigated communion, which would be over-involvement in the problems and suffering of others, are linked with poor health, anger, and relationship problems. And so the proper mode of being synthesizes the masculine and the feminine impulses. Kaufman also reviews evidence that moral exemplars like Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. were characterized by what he calls enlightened self-interest, showing an integration of the agency and communion drives in such a way that advancing their own interests necessarily involved helping others. And that's the synthesis, right? You want to pursue your own selfish interest in the world, but you want to do it in such a way that it integrates you with the people around you. So these moral exemplars were able to discover a non-zero-sum game in which they could help others while also achieving their own aims. Right? They weren't selfless, at least not purely so. For the moral exemplars, agency was always in the service of communion, and this is logos in the service of agape. Internal complexification in the service of external complexification. That's what I would suggest. Kaufman says, and I quote, that for most of us, the greatest source of growth, energy, and wholeness comes about when our agentic drive to realize the deepest part of us is harmoniously integrated with our drive to have a positive effect on others, whether it's through mastering a craft, giving birth to an artistic creation, inspiring leadership, or being involved in a humanitarian organization. We tend to be most happy, persistent, productive, and high-performing when we both feel self-determined and are motivated to make a positive impact. End quote. And so agency in the service of communion is one manifestation of what it means to embody the logos in the service of agape, is what I would suggest. So I think it's also worth mentioning here, because we're looking at this in terms of the masculine and the feminine, some research on testosterone and oxytocin. So testosterone is strongly predictive of personality traits associated with agency, this self-assertive tendency. It's, of course, as everybody knows, it's associated with perceptions of masculinity, and it's higher in men by a lot than it is in women. Oxytocin, on the other hand, it's not necessarily higher in women, but it is a hormone that is involved in binding people together. This is both true in terms of binding us with other individuals, but also with groups, and it is associated with communal motives. Oxytocin is also involved in the childbirthing process, in lactation, and in the promotion of maternal nurturing behaviors. Indeed, what we think happened evolutionarily is that evolution basically co-opted the hormone associated with maternal bonding for other social purposes. And what that means, technically, is that our capacity for agape is evolutionarily connected to the maternal instinct, and that's true even in men. Right? Even in men, it's still that evolutionary connection is still there. Richard Tarnas, I talked about this great book, The Passion of the Western Mind, in part 6. And in that book, he traces the development of ideas over the course of Western history, from the advent of Greek philosophy to the postmodern condition. And Tarnas describes the history of Western culture as a series of crises that are engendered by the tension between the symbolic father, which is conservatism, the great father, which is order, and the son, which is the process of change. This dialectic, Tarnas claims, ultimately propels and is propelled by, is, as it were, in the service of, yet a larger overarching dialectic involving the feminine, or life. Again, we're seeing the same pattern here. Right? This is the logos in the service of agape. Right? It's this process of complexification as it manifests as the hero, right, the creative hero, in the service of the feminine, or life, or agape. So when you are enacting and embodying the logos in the service of agape, you are participating in a cosmic process that Richard Tarnas describes as being fundamental to the development of Western culture. And we see in this image on the right, which I've shown before here, that the Great Mother, this is why the Great Mother is seen as the container of the world, right? So we have the archetypal son, which is the logos, the hero, and that's nested inside of agape, right? Inside of this. And then, in our communal life and community life, it's the individual nested inside the communal process that is agape. So bringing this all together, trying to bring it all together, from the smallest levels of analysis to the largest, there is a self-assertive tendency that is associated with order, the masculine, the logos. And there is also an integrative tendency, which is associated with chaos, the feminine, and agape. And as we talked about, each of these aspects has a positive and a negative guise. Right? We talked about this in part 2. Order is both security and tyranny. Chaos is both creative and destructive. And we've been discussing different manifestations of these tendencies, both the positive and the negative aspects, throughout this series of videos. The synthesis of these tendencies constitutes, I would suggest, an agent-arena relationship that we can aspire to, in which our self-assertive tendencies find their full expression in the service of an integrative tendency involving our participation in the increasing scope of non-zero-sum games. And that amounts to an increase in complexity, as we talked about in part 3. And so this is internal complexification in the service of external complexification. It is putting yourself together so that you can put the world together. Right? That's logos and agape. So I'm going to come back to Nietzsche here, and Nietzsche's criticisms of Christianity. And Nietzsche proposed this dichotomy of Dionysus versus the crucified. So in opposition to the figure of Christ, at least as Christ is normally understood by Christians, Nietzsche proposed the figure of Dionysus. Dionysus was the Greek god of madness, wine, chaos. In The Will to Power, which was unpublished, Nietzsche said this about this, and I quote, "Dionysus versus the crucified. There you have the antithesis. It is not a difference in regard to their martyrdom. It is a difference in the meaning of it. Life itself, its eternal fruitfulness and recurrence, creates torment, destruction, the will to annihilation. In the other case, suffering, the crucified as the innocent one, counts as an objection to this life, as a formula for its condemnation. One will see that the problem is that of the meaning of suffering, whether a Christian meaning or a tragic meaning. In the former case, it is supposed to be the path to a holy existence. In the latter case, being is counted as holy enough to justify even a monstrous amount of suffering." End quote. Now, the point here is that the way that Christians interpret Jesus' death is life-negating, Nietzsche believes, and I believe. Because the way that Christians typically interpret Christ's death is that it was a preparation for another life, that it was a preparation and atonement for a resurrection, for a life in another world, a future world. And for Nietzsche, this is implicitly nihilistic. It's implicitly life-negating, because what it says is that your suffering is only justified by some kind of supernatural or miraculous, event, right? Which isn't going to happen, as best we can tell. At least we have no evidence it's going to happen. It's nihilistic because it assumes that life is worth nothing unless there's something other than life to justify life. Right? That's why the Christian interpretation is nihilistic. The Dionysian interpretation, on the other hand, says that the sacrifice itself was good enough. Right? That the life that was lived in the service of that sacrifice was good enough, and that being is holy enough to justify even a monstrous amount of suffering. That's the Dionysian interpretation of martyrdom. So, as I said, in its normal interpretation, the sacrifice of Christ was made to guarantee an afterlife. Right? That's why it's life-negating, because it denigrates the only life that we actually have, this life. Jesus, according to this interpretation, died to guarantee a better life in another world rather than to affirm life in this world, the only one that actually exists as far as I can tell. Dionysus represents the idea that life in this world is holy enough to justify a tremendous amount of suffering, while Christ, for Nietzsche, represents the idea that this world, along with its attendant suffering, is only valuable insofar as it is a preparation and atonement for another, more valuable afterlife. Well, that's nihilism. That's a denigration of the only world that actually exists, the only life that actually exists. And so here we want to see if we can reconcile these warring opposites, the Christ and Dionysus. Is Christ and his sacrifice necessarily life-negating? Nietzsche wrote 5 books in the final year of his sanity. It was the most productive year of his life. And as I said before, he also discovered Dostoevsky's work in early 1887, which was 2 years before his descent into insanity. And it's disputed as to what exactly happened in 1889 when Nietzsche irreversibly collapsed into madness. One version of the story states that Nietzsche, seized by compassion upon seeing a horse being beaten in the streets, flung himself in front of it and shielded it from the blows, and he was never lucid again after that. He went insane and never recovered. As many others have pointed out, this scene is eerily reminiscent of a scene from Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, in which Raskolnikov had a dream that he was a little boy again, and he saw a horse being beaten to death and attempted to intervene. That story goes something like this, and I quote, "On January 3rd, 1889, in an outburst, Nietzsche left the home of his host in the Italian city of Turin to witness a scene which irreversibly touched his soul, a horse being whipped by the driver of a chariot. Seeing this, Nietzsche threw himself onto the neck of the animal to defend him from the blows. He immediately burst into tears. That same day, he was almost arrested for rioting, but was saved by his Italian host and taken home. The episode, hovering somewhere between legend and reality, marks the beginning of the madness which was to last 11 years until the very day of Nietzsche's death." Near the beginning of the novel Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov, the protagonist, about to starkly murder 2 elderly women, lays anxious in bed. As a kind of premonition to the guilt and horror that will beset him after the crime, he dreams of himself as a child, walking with his father in a provincial town. Outside a tavern, the 2 of them see a crowd surrounding a horse, unable to pull a wagon full of people. It's just too heavy. Here begins the parallelism with Nietzsche in Turin. The owner of the horse beats the animal again and again, responding to those who protest his cruelty, that the animal is his property. The young Raskolnikov approaches and attempts to stop the blows raining down. When the horse eventually falls, the child embraces him, only finally torn away by his father. At that moment, the protagonist, Raskolnikov, wakes from his nightmare. Raskolnikov understands the dream as a premonition and knows that he is simultaneously horse, boy, and the man with the whip. He then gets out of bed, dresses, and prepares himself for the murder. The episode of the horse is deeply important to Crime and Punishment. In Dostoevsky's notebooks of the time, one can see that he'd planned the scene prior to writing the novel, and that he looked carefully at where it was to be inserted and changed his mind at least 6 times. But a similar event, a horse cannot pull a wagon and is beaten for it, appears in his final novel, The Brothers Karamazov. Curiously, another scene of a battered horse appears in a poem by Nikolai Nekrasov, a contemporary of Dostoevsky's, only slightly older than Nietzsche. The lively anecdote is thus considered particularly Russian. End quote. Soon after this supposed incident, and of course we'll never really know, I think, whether or not this incident actually happened in the way that it's described. It has taken on a kind of legendary status at this point. And so soon after going insane, Nietzsche wrote a series of short letters to some of his friends. These letters were basically incoherent and reflected his loss of contact with reality. What's very interesting about these letters is that he signed most of them as either Dionysus or the Crucified, right, which were these opposites that he had. Right, he opposed Dionysus and the Crucified, and yet in the end, in his insanity, he identified with both of them simultaneously. Many authors, right, I say some here, but really it's the mainstream interpretation of Nietzsche's insanity is that he had syphilis. There's never been much evidence for this. It doesn't make any sense as far as I'm concerned. If you have degenerative brain disease because of syphilis, you are not going to write 5 books in the year before you lose your mind, right? It doesn't make any sense at all. Because syphilis is a degenerative condition. You will gradually get worse over time. And the fact is that Nietzsche was extremely productive and lucid before his insanity. Lucid in the sense that the 5 books that he wrote were great books. Right? These were not mediocre works of philosophy. They were great books. And so some people have blamed this on syphilis, but a more convincing argument, in my opinion, has been made recently for bipolar disorder. Nietzsche associated the Overman with Dionysus. We talked about this in part 8, the end of the Will to Power part. He associated the Overman, his figure of the Overman, with Dionysus. And Jordan Peterson, in Maps of Meaning, of course, associated the revolutionary hero with Christ. For me personally, somebody who has been really obsessed with Nietzsche for the last 3 years or so, and I've spent a lot of time getting to know Nietzsche, I can't help but wonder whether leading up to his collapse, and especially because of the influence of Dostoevsky, he discovered Dostoevsky a couple years before his collapse, and Dostoevsky had a profound effect on Nietzsche because Dostoevsky was a Christian who Nietzsche thoroughly respected as a thinker. Influenced by Dostoevsky, and despite the explosive hatred that was directed towards Christianity in the Antichrist, my suspicion, and it is only a suspicion, but it is a strong suspicion, you might say, is that Nietzsche was finally able to reconcile these warring opposites of Dionysus versus the Crucified. And I can't help but wonder whether, given his long-held hatred of Christianity, this unification of these warring opposites was too much for him to handle. In fact, I think that Nietzsche saw the unity of reality and its completeness, and I think it pushed him over the edge. Did Nietzsche collapse at the end of his life? Did he collapse the distinction between Dionysus and Christ? And that's what I wonder. And that makes me wonder whether the mad god, right, the god of drunkenness, the god of wine, the god of ecstasy, Dionysus, shares an identity with Christ. And the god of chaos shares an identity with Christ. Now, this is not my attempt to water down Nietzsche in order to make him compatible with modern Christianity. I would never dare to do that. Whatever version of Christianity could be reconciled with Nietzsche would look little to nothing like what calls itself Christianity these days. Nevertheless, I think that Nietzsche did. I think it's plausible that Nietzsche did reconcile these warring opposites at the end of his life. And so is it inconceivable, right? Is it inconceivable that Christ, as he actually existed, was more Dionysian, and that would mean more imagistic, more shamanic, than modern Christianity would indicate? I strongly suspect that was the case. And I strongly suspect that the conceptualization of Christ by modern Christians has essentially nothing to do with Christ as he actually lived. That's what I think. And I don't say that because I want to offend or disrespect anybody. I say that because I think it's true. And I think it's my responsibility to say what I think is true. So that's it for the first video of part 10. And the next video is going to be the final video in this series. And so I hope you will join me there. And I hope that, I really do hope that, whatever disagreements that you and I may have, listener, whatever disagreements we may have, that you have found something of use in this series. So I hope to see you on the next one. Goodbye.